Facebook, and I'm just going to do both right now, Mike. So this is a portion that really is from the middle of the book of Leviticus. It's actually dead smack in the middle of the Torah, which means that usually we read this in April and May. So if your bar mitzvah or bat mitzvah was April or May, you had a chance of reading Achrei Mot. But as we've said before, what's interesting about this portion is that we actually read it at Yom Kippur. So the tradition we have of reading Leviticus chapter 16 goes back to when the Torah portions were kind of set for the holidays, that this portion was picked to be the portion for Yom Kippur, as you'll soon see. Actually, the Reformed tradition over the last 50 years or so has not to read this portion, which is interesting because this portion specifically about the let me pop this up. It's specifically about Yom Kippur, but because I think the logic went like this. This is from Leviticus, and as we know, there's a lot of laws in it, and there's a lot of sacrifices in it. And the idea was, since everyone comes to synagogue on Yom Kippur, let's do a portion that will maybe be more powerful. And so that was the logic that went into it. It's also it's been interesting over the last few years, because while most synagogues read chapter 16, we read chapter 16 at Yom Kippur services, that chapter 18, which is also read on Yom Kippur, usually in the afternoon in Orthodox synagogues. Most other synagogues don't read a Torah portion. They only read Jonah in the afternoon. But you'll see from chapter 18, it includes the laws of prohibited sexual unions. And some people have speculated the reason that was done thousands of years ago was that Yom Kippur was actually a day when people would be fixed up. It was a day of love connections, which seems weird because Yom Kippur doesn't seem like the most romantic holiday. But the Talmud says that the most romantic holidays of the year are Yom Kippur and Tu B'Av, with the 15th of Av. So it's interesting that there was a tradition. And so some people said that the reason why it's there is to caution people to make sure they knew what were the accepted and prohibited marriages. The reason why some people don't like reading Leviticus chapter 18, which we'll get to, and I promise we'll allow for enough time for it, is that within the context of prohibited and acceptable, I guess, marriages, is a very famous line of the Torah. Actually, one of the few lines that some people know, which is the prohibition on homosexual relationships. So when people get agitated about the Torah, they tend to get agitated about really two lines, which are very close together. From Leviticus chapter 18, we'll see this week, and next week, we'll see from Leviticus chapter 20, the two lines that deal with homosexuality or I should say specifically homosexual relationships or sexual relationships, but we'll get to it. And I promise we'll leave enough time for that. But it's towards the end of the parsha. It's towards the end of the portion. So it's 16, 17, and 18. And let's take a look, because the portion Achrei Mot comes from the fourth word here, Achrei, or the fourth and fifth word, Achrei Mot, after the death. Adonai spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron who died when they drew too close to the presence of Adonai. And we read that back in chapter 10. So about 6 chapters ago, we read about that. It was a few lines. It was not a lot of lines. We talked about it then. And just to refresh your memory, it just says that Nadav and Avihu offered up alien fire. Doesn't really say exactly what that fire was, but they got burned up by it and they were killed by it. The sources on it are obviously intrigued. So the Talmud, the Midrash, even sources that are older than that. Some of the existing like pseudepigrapha and other commentaries from people in the Dead Sea Scrolls and things like that, they were fascinated by this, because here you have a story of two men that were burned up for maybe doing something wrong, but maybe just, I would say, maybe not doing it intentionally. Maybe doing it without doing anything other than maybe getting too close, which are some of the theories about, again, what is really going on with Nadav and Avihu. And that they weren't necessarily bad, but they were just either too zealous or they were maybe a little negligent. And as Mike just said, maybe a little shickered, maybe a little drunk. Because the next passages we saw in chapter 10 said that priests are not allowed to drink. And so as we talked about, the rabbis speculated, though it doesn't say it, was that the issue was that they were drunk and that priests are cautioned now not to lose any type of wherewithal to make sure that they have full cognition and ability when they do priestly things. So all it says right here is that afterwards, after the death, so we read Tazria and Matzorah, the stories of the lessons about skin diseases and emissions and things that rendered people impure. And before that, we read about kashrut and animals that could render us impure. So we kind of went into a whole thing about impurity, and now we're getting into cleaning up the temple and to some extent dealing with that impurity and kind of dealing with stuff that will allow us to fix our lives, and specifically leads to the day of Yom Kippur. But we'll see why. Originally, the context is cleaning up after the deaths of these two men. Yeah.
It seems to me that was a major punishment from God. I don't remember since those ancient times, if there have been those kind of major punishments that were attributed to God or godly influence.
Yeah, well, look, there's a couple of places in the Torah where we're left with these questions about, well, God definitely punished these people, so what's the lesson? And again, usually it's be very careful when you're dealing with holy things. So there's this story, and then there's another story that we read actually on Tuesday recently, which is the story of when David brought in the ark into Jerusalem, and it slides off the cart, and this guy, Uzzah, the guy on the street, tries to help out by rushing up and trying to stop it from falling, and he dies. He has a heart attack and dies. He wasn't permitted to touch the ark, and he did. And he wasn't doing it for any bad reason, but he dies. So the punishment seems like this one to be very serious because we're dealing with God's presence. We're dealing with the things that are closest to God. But, look, there are a lot of people who say that the punishment that Moses deals with not being able to go into the land, while it's not death, for him, it was crushing. And we know it's crushing because he asks God numerous times to not do it. And in the Midrash, the discussion of Moses pleading with God and asking God, just let me in. Let me not go in as Moses. Let me go in as a mouse. Let me just walk behind somebody else incognito. It's devastating for Moses. So it was worse than death to him. And so I think that there are cases where people feel like, well, God's punishment is kind of beyond our rationale and seems to be, in some cases, very harsh. Look, there's this understanding sometimes within Judaism, which takes the line that what Nadav and Avihu did was actually, to some extent, a precursor to every Jew who ever was martyred, which is that the good do die young. And that Nadav and Avihu, while they died, are taken to heaven. They're not, they don't go to hell or whatever the punishment after death is. And there is this understanding to some extent that kind of fits into the Jewish narrative for much of, especially the last 2,000 years, which is that individual suffering is actually not an indication of not being favored by God. On the contrary, it is that God loves you. And that's why you're suffering. So it's a way of making sense of loss and of sadness and of answering that question, why do bad things happen to good people? And so one of the answers is that good people have to suffer disproportionately. I don't know. But that is an answer given. And it's an answer given specifically for Nadav and Avihu in the classical texts, in the Midrash and in the Talmud, is that these guys are not bad guys. And here it doesn't give anything like there's no indication here that they did anything, that they were bad people, but that they
did anything
evil. Yeah. But that they drew too close in the presence of Adonai. So again, too close for God, wasn't too close for them. They didn't think they were doing anything wrong. Look, there was a tradition that we know of, because the Talmud talks about it, that the high priest, before he went into the temple, and you're going to see in a second, the only time they can go into the temple is at Yom Kippur. When they went into the temple, before he went into the temple, the night before, they washed him, they got him ready for it. And they got a sub ready for him, just in case he died. Mm-hmm. Now, there's a weird line in here too, which I will, since I mentioned that, I will tell you too, which is that it also says in here that the priest has to be, well, the priest makes expiation for his wife and for his family. So there's a question in the it was not a question, there's a statement, and then people question, was that really true? Because it says that he has a wife, the implication is he has to be married. So what if his wife dies? And so the Talmud actually says that they prepared they didn't see he slept with her or he married her, but they got a woman ready just in case his wife died before Yom Kippur. Now there's a debate over that, and some people say that doesn't make any sense, because what if that woman died? Then they had to get another woman ready. So they didn't quite buy that would happen, but they were definitely scared that the priest would die or that something would happen. And it went further than that, because once the priest actually went into the temple on Yom Kippur, some people know what I'm about to say. The priest went in with in the Holy of Holies, he went in with a cord around his foot. A strong cord.
They wouldn't have to go in and die.
Because they can't go in. And they were so sure that there was a possibility of this happening that they had him on a leash.
Oh my God.
Just in case he died. No, that's the Talmud. That's the Talmud. That is a law in the Talmud, that there was a cord wrapped around the high priest's foot. What? Lady in waiting. She's a priest lady in waiting. I will tell you, my ankle. No, it's not necessary. No, though I do worry about things like that. Not before the high holidays, though. It's become after my experience, my near-death experiences last year, I started to, but I actually do think about things like that. I was like, God forbid I die before, with a trip to Israel. I want this trip to still go. I don't, I tell people, I say, the show must go on, but no. So thanks for bringing that up, Mike. But yes, I have thought about it. Anyways, that's right. I had a leash. It was on my boogie board, and it broke. There was no leash on life. No leash on life, man. It was terrible. Anyways, so what does it say? After that, it says, Adonai said to Moses, tell your brother Aaron that he is not to come at will into the shrine behind the curtain, in front of the cover that Sorry, people, we froze. We froze, and this happened the other day. So this yeah, I'm sorry, we froze. Sorry. We're going to get it on right now, folks. Yep, it's coming through. People are texting me and telling me we're frozen. So I promise we're going to get it on.
I am so surprised.
Yeah.
First time I've done it my whole life.
Yeah.
At the contest. Right?
Yeah.
Like all the high holidays, I go through the motions. I read what's in front of me, right?
Yep.
Which is the same thing every year for the most part.
Yep. And that's the problem,
But this
right?
is all the outlier stuff. Not outlier. This is the, and I'm thinking, really, this was written 3,000 years ago?
Yep. And the problem is that because this is the stuff that people, that you're right, because people are only reading a few passages usually in their lifetime as adults, they're missing out what the rest of the context is. So it's a problem. I mean, the problem,
This is important.
yeah,
Important.
it's a problem. And the problem is that most kids only, most people stop reading the Torah as kids, which means, as I've said many times, they're not reading the Torah because we have to take out a lot of the Torah for kids because it's not for kids. It's not written for kids. And so we have these children's versions of stories, and we have these children's adaptations, and we have these edited versions of Torah that we share with kids, but it's really tough. And it is even tough, and I've mentioned this before, for bar and bat mitzvahs. Because, for example, if we're reading this portion, Achrei Mot, we're going to focus on the Yom Kippur laws. I'm not going to focus on homosexuality and bestiality. I'm not going to do that. It doesn't, if I do that, I'm probably going to get in trouble. So whatever I say is gonna get somebody riled up. So So this is a perfect example of something that I have to be careful. And look, I give kids the Torah, right? So I'll give them the book to read out of while we're reading it. And so that doesn't, that I've had curious, and what am I going to do? I'm not punishing these kids. They'll read on and they'll say, hey, what's that? Wait, what's that? So yeah, it's very interesting because the Torah is definitely not for kids, and we're back up. So now we're going to get into the expiation, how to fix this. So the priest is all wearing white. He's washed his body. And it says from the Israelite community, he shall take 2 he-goats for a sin offering. And for those who come to Yom Kippur, you'll remember this scene. Aaron is to offer his own bull of sin offering to make expiation for himself and for his household. So there's a very important issue here, which is that Aaron makes a sin offering for himself and for his own household, which means the priest has to do something for himself and for his family. Aaron shall take the 2 he-goats and let them stand before Adonai at the entrance of the tent of meeting. And he shall place lots upon the 2 goats, one marked for Adonai and the other marked for Azazel. We have no idea what Azazel is, which is why it's not translated. So you'll see some people say that it is a place. You'll see some people say that it's an entity. And there is
I don't want to see what the next says.
Yes, scapegoat is the word that is used a lot. Azazel, because it sounds like either a name or a place, has led people to the idea that maybe it was a demon or some other force of nature. There are legends that this is part of what was at root there in the first place, was kind of a softening of a weird kind of cultic ritual. But there's definitely something going on here, which is, again, where we get the word scapegoat from. This is a goat that is where the sins of the community are put on it. One that's sacrificed and one that's kind of set loose. Some people said it went off a cliff. They made sure it died. And it's not like somebody could have accidentally found it and accidentally eaten it later and go, this tasty goat. And then somebody goes, but that had all our sins on it. So that wouldn't have happened. So there's a real feeling like that might have been the case. Look, but there are legends and there are stories and there's midrash about Azazel being an actual demon. A few years ago, there was a movie with Denzel Washington called The Fallen, and the demon in that movie that possesses people is called Azazel. It was based on these legends. So there's a new movie about Jewish demonology called The Offering, which I don't know if it refers to this kinds of stuff, but sounds like it might. I will not be seeing it. I was offered a sneak preview last week, and I took a hard pass on that. I'm not a big fan of the horror genre, but there are Jewish demon legends, and they made a couple movies about them lately. So this is we don't know though. It's probably, again, the basis for this might have been some other kinds of traditions in the ancient world. We found some parallel traditions in other cultures of scapegoats, of things like this. But let's read what happens. Aaron shall bring forward the goat designated by lot for Adonai, which he is to offer as a sin offering, while the goat designated by lot for Azazel shall be left standing alive before Adonai to make expiation with it and to send it off to the wilderness for Azazel. Aaron shall then offer his bull offering to make expiation for himself and his household. He shall slaughter his bull of sin offering, and he shall take a panful of glowing coals scooped from the altar before Adonai and 2 handfuls of finely ground aromatic incense, and bring this behind the curtain. He shall put the incense on the fire before Adonai so that the cloud from the incense screens the cover that is over the Ark of the Pact, lest he die. So there is some ritual of incense that he performs to make smoke. Probably pretty important, and was seen as kind of a way to almost hide God, right? So that God isn't going to be seen, the glory of God wouldn't be seen behind that. So the fire has to be done in a certain way. And again, maybe this is why what Nadav and Avihu did was wrong, because either they tried to see God through the fire, or some type of way of connecting to God through that fire. But there's definitely something going on here with the fire and with the incense. Then it says Aaron, or eventually the priest, shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger over the cover of the east side, and in front of the cover he shall sprinkle some of the blood with his finger 7 times. Again, very reminiscent of what he did when he dedicated the Mishkan, the tabernacle, in the first place. And again, this ritual is one of cleansing through the blood. So what's interesting about this is they use the blood for cleansing purposes. So sometimes blood seems to be, as we talked about last week, seems to be to have impurities, but other times it seems to have the exact opposite, which is that it makes things holy. So what we know about it is it's definitely considered powerful. Back then, but today as well, because if you talk about people worried about some of the more dangerous types of pathogens that are carried by bodily functions, blood is one of them. It's one of the ones that freaks people out the most. And let's face it, when we were going through the AIDS crisis 30, 40 years ago now, it's hard to believe, it's 30, 35, 40 years ago, as we found out, this literally was a death sentence, was not passed by anything other than blood.
That's human.
Correct.
These are animals.
But what we know about blood pathogens is that, well, let's put it this way. We don't know for sure how many people, I mentioned this last week, how many people have died over the centuries from plagues, unless they could see them, which is why I said the emphasis on skin diseases is so high, because those are the ones you can see. But we don't know how many people died from diseases that were carried by animals or carried by blood contact. Look, in those days, the only way you would get sick from blood is if you drank it, or if you had contact with blood and you were bleeding. It wasn't very likely. Well, from animals, yes, and so and that is how the black, and that's how Black Plague spread, right? That spread. It was spread by animals, by rats, and by fleas. But one of the things that we dealt with during the AIDS crisis is that we infected millions of people by blood transfusions. The first people I knew who died of AIDS had died from being hemophiliac or or having anemia and had blood transfusions. I had no idea. And we were literally injecting people with death. So it was scary. It was scary. What? Yeah, I think they said that. I think they've said that that was, but I mean, look at Ryan White. There were lots of people that people remembered. And that was one of the things that people looked at and said, you know, look, it's harder to get it, you know, in certain ways, and it's harder to get it through, you know, but people looked at it and said, hey, what happened then 30 or 40 years ago probably happened many, many times. And we just didn't know about it, and it didn't spread through the world as fast as this did. And people didn't travel, and you know, diseases were more localized. So it was scaring people. And I think blood always scared people because they saw it as a sign of life, but they also knew it could be death. And again, when you die, oftentimes, especially if you're dying in a violent way, your blood leaves your body.
Right.
The first death we read about in the entire Bible is Cain killing Abel. And it says, your blood cries out to me. And the blood is what signifies and kind of like, it's what the death was. It's what the murder was. It was the loss of blood. All right. So let's continue this cleaning. Thus he shall purge the shrine of the impurity and transgression of the Israelites, whatever their sins, and he shall do the same for the tent of meeting, which abides with them in the midst of their impurity. And when he goes in to make expiation in the shrine, nobody else shall be in the tent of meeting until he comes out. When he has made expiation for himself and his household and for the whole household of the congregation, he shall go out to the altar that is before Adonai and purge it. He shall take some of the blood of the bull and of the goat and apply it to each of the horns of the altar. So again, purifying the altar. And the rest of the blood he shall sprinkle on it with his finger 7 times. Thus he shall purify the defilement of the Israelites and consecrate it. Let's pause right there to just look at that phrase right there. This he shall purify of the defilement of the Israelites and consecrate it. Now, I want to tell you one thing. That might be the most important line in this whole portion, and definitely in the discussion about sacrifices, and definitely in the discussion about what happens at Yom Kippur and what happened thousands of years ago in the Mishkan. And that's this. The reason why we go through this ritual is because of what human beings do. It's not what God does. It's not what another God does. It's not what God wants. To some extent, everything being equal, the reason that we do this is for this, because of what we did wrong. And so the sacrifices are not really for God. They're for this, to fix us. Now you could say that's silly. That's a stupid way of doing it. But whatever you believe about the sacrificial idea, understand this. It wasn't based on feeding God. It was based on helping people. And this is a major difference that we have in Judaism from every other religion that we've ever seen. We talked about, it feels like it's blowing cold right now. It must be, the heat must not be on. It must be. Give me 1 second, folks. Hold it 1 second. Let me just see something, because no, the heat was on. The heat was on when you were here yesterday, but I don't think
it was good yesterday, but it's not good right now. Because it's blowing cold air.
I know.
Thank you.
Well, yeah. So let's see what happens now. But it was warm when I walked in. Anyways, it was 65. Come on, man.
Well, it got colder.
It was not cold when we walked in. It wasn't cold. It's blowing cold now. Sorry, everybody. Sarah, sorry, everybody. We had to do this. Hopefully fix this. Anyways, so again, back to the sacrifices. In every other culture, people offered sacrifices that we know of for the gods to actually make the gods happy. And it talked about the sacrifices being a pleasing odor to God. It's not like God necessarily didn't like it, but that's not what the purpose of it was. The purpose of it is to make people clean again. It's to help people feel a sense of wholeness and for forgiveness. So this is what is different about these sacrifices from what we know, from what we see, what we're reading. When he finished purging the shrine, the tent of meeting, and the altar, the live goat shall be brought forward. Aaron shall lay both his hands upon the head of the live goat and confess over it the iniquities and transgressions of the Israelites. Whatever their sins, putting them on the head of the goat, and it shall be sent off to the wilderness through a designated agent. And that's what it says. He's taken out. Yes.
She acted this out every year.
She acted out this scene.
Yeah.
Who was the goat? Who was the goat?
Kids.
Oh, the kids were the goat?
Yeah.
Huh. I wouldn't want to be that kid.
No, she acted, no, it was weird what she did. It was different every year. It was really stupid.
Well, look, if the goat was the only thing that was designated as the carrier of the sins, then we would say, well, that was a separate thing. That wasn't a normal sacrifice. But we just read that the sacrifice was also, but it was specifically for Aaron and his family, for the sins. And so God wasn't doing these sacrifices for God. It was for the people.
Right.
Oh, maybe that was a midrash on how they designated the two goats. How they could tell that? No, but it's how would they tell the goats apart, right? So they had two goats. How do they keep them? How do they keep them? Because it says that there were lots. There were lots. Like how did that happen? And the midrash actually on that is that God picked them. You know, it wasn't just an accident. It wasn't picked. God picked him. Anyways, so then it says, so the goat is taken out by a designated agent. Goat shall carry on it all their iniquities in an accessible region, and the goat shall be set free in the wilderness. So if it is going to an Azazel, whatever that is, it doesn't say anything here that Azazel takes it or that it's going to him or to it. It doesn't say that. It says it's going to the wilderness. So it doesn't, whatever it was, whatever it started out as, here it is, the goat goes out free. It says, Aaron shall go into the tent of meeting, take off the linen vestments that he put on when he entered the shrine and leave them there. He shall bathe his body in water in the holy precinct and put on his vestments, and then he shall come out and offer his burnt offering and the burnt offering of the people, making expiation for himself and for the people. So again, he bathes after that ritual, makes the burnt offerings for the people. The fat of the sin offering shall he turn into smoke on the altar. The one who set the Azazel goat free shall wash those clothes and bathe the body in water, and after that he may re-enter the camp. So the guy who did the Azazel ritual, who took the goat out, he also washes, takes off his clothes, washes, and he bathes, and then he can enter the camp. Because assumedly, again, the sins of the community are on him. They don't want to have him near. The bull of the sin offering and the goat of the sin offering whose blood was brought in to purge the shrine shall be taken outside the camp, and their hides, their flesh, and their dung shall be consumed in fire. The one who burned them shall wash those clothes and bathe the body in water, and after that he may re-enter the camp. So all of these rituals that were to cleanse after Nadav and Avihu, right, require sacrifices, the Azazel, and then also afterwards a clean washing, because you're now got to be clean before you come in. Yeah, John.
This is not one time, right, that we're seeing sacrifices.
Uh-huh.
This is a constant thing.
Mm-hmm. In Leviticus in particular. Yeah, in Leviticus.
So inside the temple, inside the holy, it's a blood bath.
Yeah, well, now this one wasn't even before, right? This starts even before they have the temple, right? Because this is happening in the tabernacle in the desert. So not only are they living in the wilderness, which means they have to be taking animals and taking care of animals in the wilderness. Once it came into the temple, when they built the temple, then it was a full-blown factory of sacrifices, and there were a lot of people involved.
I have no idea. I have no idea about the history of Saul.
Yeah.
Right. So either this was a way of distributing product to folks that didn't have it, the rabbis, the priests, but there's other people too, right? Because the meat would go back.
Yeah, we're going to get to that.
Oh.
No, we're going to get to specifically the fact that
now you've got people coming out cleaning their clothes, but it's still I mean, come on, we've been to butcher shops, we've been to fish markets.
So yes, so in this text, well, let's put it this way, because we're really not going to get until Deuteronomy. In Leviticus, it does specifically like list all these sacrifices. Well, let's read what it says, and then I'll tell you what Deuteronomy says, which is why some people think Deuteronomy was written after, though it's not necessarily the case based on this piece you're going to see. But we'll see. But yes, there is a lot of blood and there's a lot of sacrifices. Now, this is what happens after Nadav and Avihu. But here's the point, and this is why we read it at Yom Kippur. For on this day of atonement shall be made for you to purify you of all your sins before Adonai. So this is why, because this is the law for all time. In the 7th month, on the 10th day, you shall practice self-denial, and you shall do no manner of work, neither the citizen or the alien who resides among you. And that is Yom Kippur. That is the day of Yom Kippur. So what happens is that this day of atonement is not the day that happened 3,000 years ago, but every year on the 7th month, in the 7th month on the 10th day. This one-time ritual becomes a yearly reenactment because the Torah just told us that we do this every year. Now, this is not the only place that we have this. We're going to have this again in Leviticus 23, the discussion of Yom Kippur, and we're going to have other discussions about His one in Numbers. So there are other places where we read this, but just understand this is the first time we've read this. This is the introduction to Yom Kippur. But the introduction to Yom Kippur and what you just read, and you saw this first 28 verses, is about a one-time event that became a yearly happening.
Am I missing something? Akron Mode? This is probably my Torah portion, it's my son's Torah portion, which is April. So
why do we read it then? We read it then because this is the portion in the order of when we're reading it that we get to it here. The Torah portion cycle started about 2,000 years ago when we started reading yearly in the synagogues. The early synagogues, Torah reading became the way that people worshiped, and so they came up with a yearly cycle of readings. And so, yes, it is very. I'm kind of answering your question that you didn't ask, which is there was probably a time when this would be read was at Yom Kippur, and people, the priests would read this section for everybody and remind them what they were doing. And I'm talking about 2,500 years ago when it first existed. And so people, there we go, another one. I'm turning off the air. It's not cooling. So, that's Yom Kippur for you right there. So April, end of April, middle of April, end of April was when this was read in the Torah cycle. But originally, again, there was no sense that this had to be read in April and May when it was first written down. They didn't say, hey, we're going to read this section in April and May when you're literally 6 months away. But again, people would say it is kind of a yearly reminder. But of course, what we did is in addition to doing Torah portions throughout the year, we had the tradition that on the holidays, we'd read special portions. And so we made sure that we read this again at Yom Kippur. So we read this at Yom Kippur. So whatever, again, the weekly portion in at the end of September or October, we're coming to the end of the Torah. We're always reading from Deuteronomy, but we read it. If Yom Kippur happened on well, it can't happen on a Saturday, but if Yom Kippur happened, no, it can happen Yom Kippur can happen. Yeah, Yom Kippur can happen. What day? It can happen on a Saturday, but not a Friday. I can't remember. It can happen on a Saturday, but not a Sunday. Can't start on a Saturday. You read this portion. You read Yom Kippur. This is the only portion you read for Yom Kippur. So again, the tradition of reading Torah portions came later. The Torah was not, when the Torah was written or edited or however you want to say it, nobody said, we're going to read this every year in April. That's the way it's going to come out. No, there was no intention for that to happen. So to answer your question, there was never intention. 2,000 years ago. The earliest readings, the earliest references to the reading orders that we have are 2,000 years ago. So it's a long time, but it was called the lectionary cycle. That's the fancy word for it. And churches have lectionary cycles too. They read certain texts every week, right? So this lectionary cycle is built around the Christian calendar. And so, certain weeks they read certain portions. So we have a lectionary cycle that goes back even older, but it's based around reading the whole Torah, reading the whole 5 books. And then to read the Haftarah, to make sure we read some of the prophets, we added the Haftarot about 2,000 years ago as well. So that's our lectionary cycle. So this Day of Atonement is going to purify your sins. And then it says here this line, it shall be a Sabbath, a complete rest for you, and you shall practice self-denial. It is a law for all time. And this is why people take it so seriously. It's a day we don't do any work. It's a Shabbat, Shabbaton. It's a Shabbat, a Sabbath of Sabbaths, a day of complete rest, and you will practice self-denial, which does not say fasting here. It says self-denial. It says literally, initem et nofshotechem, you shall, what's the King James say, Mary? Verse 31.
A Sabbath of rest unto thee, and you shall by a statute prayer.
Yep, afflict your soul. So it doesn't say specifically here that you fast. It doesn't say that. But the rabbis definitely understood it by their period that is definitely fasting and not drinking and not bathing and not anointing yourself with perfumes and oils, but not wearing leather shoes, not having sex. Those were all prohibitions. But I will tell you that the Bible itself tells us that it's a fast because, as we're going to read on Tuesday morning in a few weeks, Isaiah specifically says, is this the type of fast that I require, right? And that's the section that we actually read at Yom Kippur. So it doesn't specifically say fasts here, but by the time of Isaiah, it's definitely talking about fasts, specifically fasts. So the Bible does say fast. It doesn't say it in the Torah. It doesn't say it in the first 5 books. It does not use the word fast. It uses afflict your soul, which they translate here as self-denial. The priest who has been anointed and ordained to serve as priest in place of his father shall make expiation. He shall put on the linen vestments and the sacral vestments. He shall purge the innermost shrine. He shall purge the tent of meeting and the altar, and he shall make expiation for the priests and for all the people in the congregation. So this will continue. This tradition of expiation will continue. And again, he has to make amends and he has to make expiation for the priests. And it says, this shall be a law for you for all time, to make atonement for the Israelites for all their sins once a year. And Moses did as Adonai had commanded him. So why do people take Yom Kippur so seriously? Because it says it's a law for all time. Mm-hmm. And so even though we don't have a temple anymore, and even though we don't have sacrifices anymore, and even though we only know the priests because their last names are Cohen or Katz, we do know that Yom Kippur must have been pretty important. And we're still doing it. And so it's usually the last ritual that Jews hang on to, no matter what. And I think, of course, everybody needs to feel like they can be forgiven.
It is interesting because there are so many rules and regulations. I mean, got my right. I mean, I've been doing this a year now. I've been reading this stuff. You know, I'm finally kind of getting it, right? What's going on? It takes a while to kind of. They could have picked anything.
Yeah.
I mean,
especially given the fact that this is a law that, in the scheme of things, seems to be kind of connected to the sacrifices. Yeah. It doesn't seem to be, if someone was going to read through the Torah and say, not know anything about Judaism and say, what are the laws that are going to be kept by a society that hasn't had sacrifices for 2,000 years? Any vestige of this would probably not be high on anyone's idea of what would be a Jewish custom today. And which is another way of saying, maybe another way of saying this is, if Moses were to come back and see the world that we live in with our cars and with our
That's the first thing he'd say.
but I don't know. I think he'd be happy maybe that we're still reading the Torah, right? But I think he'd be shocked that the one thing that some Jews do is Yom Kippur. I think he'd scratch his head and say, really? That's what you decided to hold on to? That's what your last thing? And I remember years ago when he started rediscovering his Judaism, Kirk Douglas had written about Yom Kippur, and he talked about how in his furthest away from tradition, he wrote, in the furthest away from tradition, the one thing he never gave up on was fasting on Yom Kippur. He said, I wasn't doing anything. I wasn't married to a Jewish person. I wasn't doing holidays. I wasn't even, unfortunately, he says, I wasn't educating my kids in Jewish tradition. He says, the one thing I didn't do was eat on Yom Kippur. He said, I even worked on Yom Kippur. He said, one time he was shooting a movie. He says, and if you have to kiss Ava Gardner on an empty stomach, it's not easy. That's what he wrote. I'm not making it up. He said it. He said it. I didn't say it. I don't know. She seemed like a lovely woman, but he said kissing her on an empty stomach wasn't easy. So, yeah, I mean, he later on in his life, he got very involved in Jewish tradition. He had a second bar mitzvah when he was 83. And thank God he lived another 20 years almost after that. But he had a second bar mitzvah, read from the Torah, and started to take it really seriously. And his kids started getting a little bit more interested too in the tradition. So Michael's gotten more into his Jewish tradition. Yeah, his kids all were celebrating bar mitzvah. I don't think Michael Douglas was. I think he said he wasn't. He never celebrated bar mitzvah as a kid, but his kids with Catherine they went through this. He went through it, and he took it seriously. But they saw their grandfather, they wanted to follow in their grandfather's footsteps. So it's pretty cool that again. But did people bet on Yom Kippur? I don't know. If I lived 3,000 years ago, I wouldn't have bet on Yom Kippur. Of all the holidays and all the places, I don't know if that would have been the one. But anyways, so yeah.
It seems like when you read that it's Passover is
oh yeah
holiday.
Oh yeah, by far. Passover would be the holiday that you would say, hey, this is the one that the Torah goes on and on about, chapters about it. It's mentioned every time that it's there. It's even in the kind of the laws of we saw it in Exodus, in the Mishpatim section. It talked about Passover. It's going to talk about it again over and over again in Deuteronomy. Yeah, it was pretty big. And you saw for those of us who were reading Tuesday, you saw when Josiah took over and did his reforms. What did he do? He made Passover. And they said no Passover was like that ever since time of Moses. So they focused on Passover, even in the ancient world. And then even as they were developing, they loved Passover. And not because of the food. It wasn't because of the food. I want to make it clear. It was because of the importance of the story and again recounting how we got to where we got to. In this story, it's about self-improvement. So maybe that's the lesson for today, is that we focus more on self-improvement. I don't know. Some people would say that's important. Maybe one of the reasons why Yom Kippur will continue is because nobody ever needs to. There's never a bad time to talk about self-improvement, right? That's a nice way of saying it.
About getting consecrated to live for another year.
Yeah.
Yep. You
so
go and visit in order to live.
Yep. And forgiveness is always a good thing.
Yes.
It's never a bad thing to talk about forgiveness. So it seems a little tough to find in here because it's a lot about sacrifices, but the forgiveness is definitely there. And look at that line. This is about making the people feel like they can continue on. It's not about filling up God. It's about
Right.
So let's look at chapter 17, which is going to. This is going to be an interesting. This gets to the point of what John was talking about meat, about the meat. Adonai spoke to Moses, saying, "Speak to Aaron and his sons and to the Israelite people, and say to them, this is what Adonai has commanded. If anyone of the house of Israel slaughters an ox or sheep or goat in the camp, or does so outside the camp, and does not bring it to the entrance of the tent of meeting to present it as an offering to Adonai before Adonai's tabernacle, blood guilt shall be imputed to that party. Having shed blood, that person shall be cut off from among the people." So that law, John, seems to imply that, no, you don't eat any other meat except a sacrifice.
Right.
Now, this is in the wilderness, and so maybe they didn't slaughter as many animals. They were eating manna from heaven, and so maybe but there is this understanding here that it was a possibility that people didn't eat meat unless there was some sacrifice being done to it. In Deuteronomy, we have a rule that says you don't have to only eat meat that's for a sacrifice, which is why some people think that it's written after is kind of a way to put this away. I'm not so sure, but and some people think that this was written actually after Deuteronomy. So it's still, we don't know. I don't think you can necessarily know from that, but there definitely were traditions, or at least there was a possibility that when they were in the wilderness, let's just put it this way, according to this, it's pretty serious if you ate meat and you didn't offer it as a sacrifice, part of it. Remember, you're not offering the best parts on the altar, you're kind of offering the worst parts on the altar. But it seems to imply here that animals were not sacrificed in the wilderness unless the animals were being sacrificed, unless there was some kind of sacrifice. So it's a pretty serious law. The punishment is karet. It's being cut off from the community. So this is in order that the Israelites may bring the sacrifices which they have been making in the open, that they may bring them before Adonai to the priest, to the tent of meeting, and offer them as sacrifices of well-being to Adonai. Now, are these sacrifices that are being offered to other gods? Are they being offered to God? Are people only sacrificing, only killing things when they're offering sacrifices? I don't know. But it says right here, they must be brought to God. And that the priest may dash the blood against the altar of Adonai at the tent of meeting and turn the fat into the smoke as pleasing odor to God. There's the pleasing odor to God, so God does like it. And that they may offer their sacrifices no more to the goat demons after whom they stray. There shall be to them a law for all time throughout the ages. So there it seems that it's not just in the wilderness, that it never should be offering up animals anywhere else. But again, is it animals or is it offerings? Is it anytime you're eating meat, or is it connected to the fact that they don't want to offer up things to like these demons, these goat demons? That's probably not the translation in the King James, right? It doesn't say goat. No. Yeah. So there's took another step. In those days, it might not even be a devils, they're goat powers, whatever you want to call them. The word in Hebrew is simply se'arim, which is a word we use for goat. But it clearly is some kind of goat stuff, which is why the Azazel thing maybe is connected to it. I mean, we don't know, but the fact is that this is one of the reasons why the devil was depicted with goat feet, was because it's a goat. It's got a part goat to it. But again, they offered to Pan and to some of these goat footed gods, were part of worship throughout the Greek world, and through other societies, obviously, had these goat demons. But again, it says here, you're supposed to make any kind of meat offerings at the tent of meeting. What's the reason? So that they don't offer them up to other gods, so that they don't do bad stuff with the meat and with the offering. So that's what it says. And it doesn't say this is only when you're in the wilderness. It says a law for all time. So again, it's to prevent, people from doing bad stuff with the blood, with the animals, making them go off to God's. But of course, there's something else here too. which is that the priests get their cut.
Mhm.
If the offerings are done anywhere else, the priests aren't getting it. So you got to bring it to the priests. The priests get their cut.
And the priest also distributes it to other poor people that don't have animals.
Assumedly, there were other people that were getting it down the line, but this is definitely about controlling that
The food.
resource.
I'm cheating a little bit because
Yep.
we're reading the text, but I'm also reading the commentary.
Yep, that's good. Yep.
And right.
Yep.
My Torah study, but should have done it before, I guess. But the more I read, the more a meat meal, right? A meat meal in this time was not the rule; it was the exception.
Correct.
So that means Joyce and I, who aren't priests, wouldn't be very often that we'd have a meat meal.
Correct.
But the priests
probably had meat a lot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. The priests had meat disproportionately to what the other people had. Now, one would say that's a benefit of being a priest. But remember, they also had meal offerings. They also had first fruit offerings. So it wasn't just meat that was offered. The sacrifices take up a lot of the time because they're the offerings that create expiation. They're the ones that are used for cleansing and for freeing one of guilt. So the animals were oftentimes used for those really serious and obviously kind of dramatic offerings. But there were other offerings too. We read about the lechem panim, the bread that's offered, the matzot that are offered.
Mm-hmm.
There is other types of offerings, which some of them were burned and some of them were eaten by the priests. But yes, the priests are definitely supported by these things, and they would have had a lot more meat than the general population, which again, in the ancient world probably meant that they had a better source of protein.
So one other question.
Because they didn't have soy products.
So,
they didn't have fish either, by the way, for the most part, because they lived in the wilderness or they lived in the mountains, right? So they didn't have a lot of fish. Yeah.
So how do you correlate this to Genesis 1:29?
Yes. Which is that they're not supposed to eat meat, right?
Well, that according to Genesis, man was supposed to be a vegetarian. Genesis
Correct.
1:29. And then when Noah was given permission to eat animal food, he was warned strictly against consuming
Blood. Yep.
Right?
So
this is all starting to come together now.
Yeah. So yeah, good, because what it's telling us is that the Bible's vision of man and woman in Eden was that they did not eat meat, and they're not given permission until Noah. And so that's, again, I mentioned it before. That was the week that I became a vegetarian, was reading the Noah portion. That was my anniversary. It was October, whatever, in 1994, where I decided I'm not eating meat anymore, because if that's not the way I was supposed to be from the beginning, why am I doing it? And so I gave it up. It was that Torah portion that year. However, it finally clicked in me that I'm only eating meat because I like it. And so if everything else, including the Torah, is telling me, but you were not meant to eat meat, that's why I stopped. And again, I did it, my body told me it was the right thing to do. And look, it's not easy. It's not, there's, especially for someone like me who ate meat all the time. But our ancestors didn't eat meat all the time, and the priests probably ate a lot more meat than everybody, but they didn't eat meat at every meal. But they probably ate meat a lot more, which is why they probably were stronger and healthier and probably lived longer than most other people. I'm a vegetarian, but I'm the first to admit that in the ancient world, it would have been hard to be a vegetarian. It would have been hard to get enough protein sources from beans and from eggs and from cheese. It can be done. There were people in the ancient world who did it, but it would have been hard. But only the really wealthy people had meat on a regular basis. So every day, only the wealthy people, and only people like the priest. So by being a priest, you essentially are artificially wealthy. Now, I will tell you that eating more meat led to things like gout and other diseases that were called rich men diseases, because only people who ate meat regularly could do that. But our ancestors, up until 200 years ago, didn't eat meat very often. And if they did, it was usually, something that was heavily salted, because they couldn't get it that often, and they didn't eat as much as we do today. So our ancestors would have they'd have chicken on Friday night, which was about the cheapest food that meat that they could get, and they'd make it into soup, and they'd make it into, and they'd eat a chicken, and that was a big deal to have a chicken. But they didn't kill a cow very often, for sure.
So they're in the wilderness, right? So there's only so many people that can be herders, right?
Yep.
Right. So other people were doing other chores, whatever they were, but this wasn't a city center.
Nope.
Right. And so you're telling me they were raising their animals specifically for sacrifice.
It's according to this, they were doing it exactly in the wilderness. And it's an interesting point because the laws, as we saw in Exodus and in Leviticus about the Mishkan, about building it and facilitating all the sacrifices for it, take up pages. Now, what we know is that there was, or what we believe is there was a Mishkan, there was a tabernacle, and we don't have it, and so we can't point to it, but we do believe that there was at one point definitely a Mishkan, a traveling thing. But if these laws were written primarily by people who were living at the time of the temple in Jerusalem, it's safe to say that some of what they wrote was anachronistic and went back to their time and not really back to that time. So to assume that all the sacrifices or as many sacrifices were going on then in the Mishkan in the wilderness for 40 years, yeah, it's possible. And you're getting to this point, John, is do they really offer that many sacrifices when they were in the wilderness? And they probably offered sacrifices, but maybe not at the level that they did once they had a city center and once they had the produce for it. So, but here specifically is this issue of we're going to get to the blood. If anyone partakes, it says is cut off, and for the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have assigned it to you. And this is what, again, where John was talking about the lines from Genesis, for making expiation for your lives, and upon the altar it is blood as life that affects expiation. So again, it's pretty much spelled out as we talked about, that blood is life, and it also can create forgiveness. Therefore, I say to the Israelite people, no person shall among you shall partake of the blood, nor shall the stranger who resides among you partake of the blood. So there it says right there specifically, do not have the blood in the food, which is why the kosher meat was so heavily salted, so that all the blood would come out of it. And if any Israelite or any stranger who resides among them hunts down an animal or any bird that may be eaten, that person shall pour out its blood and cover it with the earth. So what is it telling us? If you're one of those people that is hunting, you better not come back with blood in that meat. So it's definitely not kosher. It's not that food was going to be kosher, but they're basically saying if you're going to eat it, if somebody's eating it, and again, they're talking about strangers who reside among you, who are maybe more likely to have had that desire to go out hunting. Look, the Israelites knew that there was a desire to eat meat that was hunted. And by that, I mean by animals that you did not raise on your farm. Whatever it was, rabbit. I mean, deer is kosher, but no one raises deer. They do it now. There's kosher venison that people raise, but it was usually hunted. So they knew people like to eat it. They always like to eat it, and some people like it. And so there's a midrash that in the world to come, you get to eat all those kinds of meats that aren't kosher now. You get to eat stuff that's hunted. So if you don't eat it now, you get to eat it in the world to come. So I guess people knew that it was good, and they liked it. So you get to eat it in heaven. But they didn't want people to eat it, and they didn't want people to have the blood in their food. And again, you can say what you want, but it probably kept people alive longer too. So you can say what you want, but you read those lines, and when you go into the restaurant that say, don't eat raw fish or raw, or whatever it says, whatever it says, whatever the law says you have to put up there now, that They can, raw fish and raw meat can cause you to be sick. You have to put that in the menu now. You have to put that on a restaurant. They have to post that. Well, they do it because people got sick. There's a reason for it. People got sick, and they get sick. They continue to get sick if they have the blood. And here it says specifically, for all life of all flesh, all life, the kol basar, kol nefesh, kol basar. And it uses the word, it says all. The blood is life. Yeah. Therefore, I say to the Israelite people, you shall not partake of the blood of any flesh, for the life of all flesh is its blood. Anyone who partakes of it shall be cut off. Any person, whether citizen or stranger, eats what has died or has been torn by beasts, shall wash those clothes, bathe in water, remain impure until evening, and then shall be pure. But if the clothes are not washed and the body is not bathed, that person shall bear the guilt. So how would someone eat any of that stuff? Well, sometimes you have to. You don't have a choice. You're out on the road, you're cut off from everybody. Yeah, it happened. You're not supposed to. It says right there, you're cut off if you do it. You're not supposed to, but it's serious. But if you have to, and we're about to get to that line in the Torah, you live by these laws. You don't die by them. So if you have to, you eat what you have to eat. But there's a way to cure it, right? There's a way to purify yourself if you do it. And then you bathe, you wash your clothes, and you're impure for the evening, but then you're okay. So you got to go through that ritual of cleansing after you ate something that was not healthy.
Ritual of cleansing over and over again also was a sign that you could be healthier if you keep clean.
Yeah, for sure. So, again, all of these laws about all of these laws are to help keep people alive. We're going to get to it. But now we turn to chapter 18, the chapter in question right now. And I told you we'd leave enough time to get to this, which is what happens with a person. Well, let's read it. So we talked about sacrifices. We talked about purity, Yom Kippur. And now we're getting into, which then led us to the discussion of eating blood and not having blood. And then we get into this, which is, as we talked about relationships. But let's read the context, the full context. Adonai spoke to Moses saying, speak to the Israelite people and say to them, I, Adonai, am your God. You shall not copy the practices of the land of Egypt, where you came from, or the land of Canaan to which you're going. I'm taking you now. Do not follow their laws. My rules alone you shall observe, and faithfully follow my laws. I, Adonai, am your God. You shall keep my laws and my rules, by the pursuit of which human beings shall live. I am Adonai. And there it is, right there. Because you should live. So, this, before we even get into the laws of what's allowed and what's not, this law is the basis for the most important principle when it comes to Jewish law, as far as I'm concerned, which is that what is the law that is the law of the Torah that overrides every law? It's this one. It's life. The law is for life. You're supposed to live through these laws, which is why in the previous paragraph, when it talked about people eating meat that was treif, literally treif, which means torn animals, roadkill, whatever you had to eat in order to live, it's okay. Because if your life depended on it, you can eat it. You can break any law in the Torah almost in order to live. Almost every law in the Torah is secondary to this law, what we call pikuach nefesh, saving a life.
Well, there are cases that we've read about when people crashed planes or were going over mountains and they went to cannibalism.
Yeah.
And would that be under this?
So to answer your question, you don't have to go outside the Torah, the Bible, to read about that. We read about it in the book of Lamentations. We read about it actually in the book of Kings, where a woman says to the king, we got a problem. I'm fighting with my neighbor over here. We ate my baby today because they were under siege. They were starving. And we were supposed to eat her baby tomorrow, and she's holding back her baby. That was the story in the Bible.
Really? Yeah. I don't remember that.
Yeah, it's in the book of Kings. We just read it on it, and we didn't just read it. We read it a couple months ago. It's a terrible story. But in the book of Lamentations, it talks about it. Look, the Torah says that you're not allowed to kill someone to save a life. But if the person's already dead, then the answer would be yes. You need anything to stay alive if it's dead. The Torah doesn't say specifically anywhere what are the exceptions to the rule. But this rule is preeminent because it says all other laws essentially come through this. Chai bahem, live through them. So the three exceptions that you're not allowed to, the things that you're supposed to die for rather than break this law of saving a life, right? Because you can violate Shabbat. If you're a doctor, you absolutely can work on Shabbat to save a life. You're not, I can't save your life. It's Shabbos now. The three laws are you can't kill somebody else. So you can't kill someone else to save a life. So if somebody ordered you to kill someone, or I'm going to kill you, you have to give up your life. So these are the three exceptions that you're supposed to martyr yourself rather than kill. That's the first. Then the first is to kill someone. Can't kill someone. Can't, because the Talmud says you can't exchange a life for a life. Can't do it. We can't do that. We can't say I'm changing one person's life for another. So you can't kill someone to keep someone else alive. You can't kill someone to take their organs and put them in another person. It's against the Torah. It's against Jewish law. So that's one. The other one's an interesting one because it's not a life or death thing. That's the only one that's going to be life or death, right? Is killing someone. So now we're going to get into one that isn't life. And that is sexual crimes. Sexual rules that we're about to read, or specifically, again, or more generally to some extent, any type of rape. So if somebody said, you must rape this person or I'm going to kill you, you're supposed to give up your life. So any type of sexual rules that you're breaking, you have to give up your life. The third one is a tough one because it's kind of a gray area, and it is a major debate within the Talmud where they actually had to face this, which is another one that you're supposed to die for. And this is a tough one because what is where it's a gray area, and the boundaries the rabbis would often debate. And the third one is idolatry. If somebody told you you have to worship another god or we're going to kill you, there was a question of whether you were supposed to give up your life in all cases or, again, because the rule is idolatry. So those three, killing, raping, or essentially, sexual crimes, or idolatry. Again, the discussion goes into being forced to convert, forced to give up God, forced to worship an idol. And there's stories in the book of Maccabees about this, about people martyring themselves rather than worshiping other gods. But there are questions about it. And so there are questions about whether or not, for example, if it's done privately. So if somebody makes you worship another god and no one can see it, do you have to give up your life? And so some of the rabbis say, well, if no one sees it, if there's not a minion, if there aren't 10 people, just say it and just, it doesn't really count.
What about during the Spanish Inquisition when you had to swear your life to Jesus in order to live.
That was considered acceptable martyrdom.
Okay.
And so
You
the
should
thousands
die.
of Jews that did that, and during the Crusades, and then before that, during the time of the Maccabees, and before that, you know,
should die instead of worshiping.
yeah. And so that those three things were the now. By the Middle Ages, there were real debates over whether or not you can fake it.
Mm.
So some people in the Spanish Inquisition did that. They faked it. They pretended that they converted and they were secretly Jewish. And the rabbis gave them permission to do that.
Prayed in secret.
Yeah, they were called conversos.
Mm-hmm.
Some people called them Marranos, which was a derogatory word, which they didn't like. It basically means like a pig. So they didn't want to be called Marranos. And those crypto Jews, those conversos, continued to practice Judaism in some cases for hundreds of years. Hidden Jews.
Mm-hmm.
But it also happened in the Muslim world because there were Jews that were forced to convert to Islam, including Rambam, Maimonides' own family. They were forced to convert to Islam, and they did it on the outside. And as soon as they got out of Spain, where they lived, they went back to practicing Judaism. Now, interestingly, they fled to Egypt, which was also Muslim, but they didn't care in Egypt. They let them go back. And there were cases of people who were conversos who fled to other Christian countries and then started practicing their Judaism. Like Holland had a huge converso community. And of course, the New World was the first Jewish immigrants were descendants of these conversos. These were Spanish Jews and Portuguese Jews who had pretended to be Jewish, pretended to be Christian, were continuing their Judaism. And they fled to Holland, which was a Christian country at the time. Those were the first American Jews were from that community. But again, some Christian countries didn't care. The first Jews that settled in England after England let Jews back in the 1600s were conversos. So these Jews went all around the world. Some of them, again, most of them fled from Christian countries, but some of them were in Muslim countries and then fled to another Muslim country where they didn't care. Look, the theory is that Columbus was a descendant of conversos who had fled from Spain and went to Italy.
Mm-hmm.
We know that his family were Spanish. That's why he spoke Spanish, but he was raised in Italy, he was raised in Genoa, and he was part, most likely, of a converso community of Spanish Jews that were living in Italy. They were living 100 miles away from the Vatican, or maybe a little further, but they were in Rome. They were not far from Rome. They were in the Roman papal-controlled lands. You were better off being a converso there than in Spain. That's the crazy thing, is that Spain was killing them, whereas Italy wasn't killing them. So most likely he was a descendant of those people. Like, all the evidence is that he was. Doesn't mean that he was Jewish. It means that his parents were Jewish, and it means that his family had were descendants of conversos. So, but that's the evidence. Yeah, John.
Can you just take 60 seconds?
Yeah.
Because I've been wanting to ask this for weeks.
Yep.
So you shall not copy the practice of the land of Egypt where you dwell, for the land of Canaan, which I take. Fine, okay. So now I backtrack all the way to Genesis.
Yep.
And to the beginning of Exodus. And I was there and I listened and I read.
Yep.
You know, I'm not the best student here, right? And I understand they left because of famine and they went to Egypt.
Yeah.
But we're taking a big leap here because there's a lot missing. I need some filler, because you can't just jump from Genesis, where it's Israel and Adam and Eve and Cain and Abel, and go through the history and go from that to now there's other people in other lands, right? So now there's Egypt and the Pharaoh. Well, where did he come from? I mean, if it's just the Jews, right? I understand the history through the Roman Empire and all that, but now we're jumping from Genesis to Exodus, right? But where did the Egyptians come from? Where did anybody else on earth? If God created earth, right? And he created Adam and Eve, and the rest of us flow from that. There's no discussion about Egypt. All there is the Exodus from Egypt. So now you're telling me, not you, right? The Bible is saying don't practice. Well, okay, but it was just God and the Jews who were promised Canaan.
So I put it up here.
So I'm missing
Okay,
something.
so here, well, maybe, I don't know if you were here that day. So when we go back to Noah, after the flood, it says that Noah has 3 sons, right? Shem, Ham, and Japheth.
Yeah.
And they were born to him after. And this is real important. So this is a good point of what John's, let's go back and look. So the descendants of Japheth, it says, are Gomer, Magog, Madai, Yavan, Tubal, Meshech, and Tiras. And then it goes through some of their descendants. Gomer is Ashkenaz. We know what Ashkenaz is. Well, at least here it says, it's the word Ashkenazi Jews come from Ashkenaz. Well, this was considered, Japheth was considered the land of Europe. We don't really know all these places. Ashkenaz is probably actually the Scythians who lived maybe above Turkey. But Yavan, we know where Yavan is. That's Greece. 100% that Yavan is the Greeks. Tubal, these other countries, we're not exactly sure. Magog and Gomer.
Those aren't people. Those are land.
Those are people. These are people whose their descendants are named after. They're named after their ancestor who was the founder of these people. So Canaan was a guy. You'll see. So people are named after their ancestor who was the founder of the community, right? Like the guy who established, the city. The city was named after him, or the country would be named after him, right? So here you have Ashkenaz. That was a guy. Yavan was a guy. Elisha, Tarshish. Remember, we've talked about Tarshish, right? So at least by the Bible's idea, he was Greek. So Kittim and the Dodanim were probably, again, Greek peoples like Philistines. And it says right here, from these, the maritime nations branched out, the Aegean people. These are the descendants of Japheth by their lands. So this is Europe, but probably more Greece. Yep. And so according to this, no, it's fine. It's according to this, there's 70. There's 70. If we add up these, there'll be 70. Now we get to Ham. Ham is the second child, or the middle child, the one who screws up. This is Cush, Mitzrayim, Put, and Canaan. So here he is. And Cush, of course, that's Sudan. Mitzrayim, Egypt.
Oh.
Right? Mitzrayim, that's Egypt. And Put is Somalia, that area, Sudan, so below Ethiopia, it's below there. What's interesting is that Canaan is lumped in with those guys. The Canaanites, according to this, are actually related to Mitzrayim and Ham. So interestingly, the Israelites saw the Canaanites as Egyptian, not as like them. Genetically, we don't know that for a fact. Genetically, actually, the Canaanites might have been closer to us, but the Bible definitely sees them as part of Ham. Now, why would that be the case? We know that the Canaanites during the 13th century, during the early Iron Age, were like Egyptians. They were using Egyptian style, they were using Egyptian art, they were using Egyptian culture. And so they might have been culturally more Egyptian. So then it goes through the descendants of Cush, which include places like Sheba, which is, again, the queen of Sheba. It's from there, all these places. And in Cush, and it talks about Nimrod, who is a descendant of Cush, who we don't know anything about Nimrod, except he was a great hunter and people say a king. And then it talks about them even being in the land all the way up to Babylon. That's where the Hamites went. But, and it says that all these areas were kind of established by him. And there it talks about Mitzrayim. So these are the Egyptians. So these are all Egyptian type tribes, right? Now, what's interesting here is it says the Kaphtorim, which was Crete and these islands. Before it says that they're Aegean, here it actually says that at least some of them came out of the Egyptians. Look, they're probably a mixture of both, but they probably were more Aegean. Here we have Canaan. Canaan begot Sidon. You know who that is. That's Tyre and Sidon. That's in Lebanon. And that is, according to tradition, where the Canaanites were. They were in Lebanon. The Jebusites, the Amorites, these are all the people that were living in the land of Israel, right? The Arvadites, the Zemarites, these are the ones that... Exactly. No, but this is important. So this is the Canaan, and here it says right there, Canaanite territory went from Sidon up in the north in Lebanon as far down as Gaza. And it included Sodom and Gomorrah and Admah. We all know those places. Those are bad people. And these are the descendants of Ham. And I will tell you one more thing about this. Whenever we talk about Ham, because Ham is African, this is why Ham is allowed to be a slave. These are why the Canaanites are allowed to be a slave. This is why black people that lived in America in the 1850s could be slaves. Because according to the Bible, they're descendants of Ham. Now, it doesn't say anything about sub-Saharan Africa. I will say that. It's not included. But because Ham is in Africa, that's how the descendants of Ham can be slaves. Because it says right up here, I'm just going to digress one more time. Right here, when Noah woke up from his wine, when he was drunk and he cursed his son, he doesn't curse Ham, he cursed Canaan, Ham's son. And he called him the lowest of slaves shall be to his brothers. And from that, folks, 3,000 years later, black people could still be held as slaves because the Bible said so. But he does, of course, Noah blesses Shem, who's our ancestor. And it says Canaan can be a slave to them. And God will enlarge Japhet, and he shall dwell in the tents of Shem, and Canaan will be a slave to both of them. So the Canaanites and the black people can be slaves to Jews. And because the descendants of Japhet are good too, they can get the same slaves that we had. Now, if you think that's ridiculous, understand that this was preached in churches in America up until the 1850s. It says so in the Bible because,
probably longer than that.
Because guess what? Guess who's a descendant of Japhet? White Anglo-Saxon Protestants, Europeans, British people, everybody from Europe. So the Europeans are given what the Semites are given. So this is a great lesson on ethnicity. So thank you, John, for taking us back to a line of this. And again, what does it say? We skipped a little bit. I'll just say, and here's our descendants. Here's Shem. This is our people. So sons were born to Shem. That's Shem is our ancestor. He has these kids, the Arameans, the Shelah, and then we get to this guy Eber, right? And then he has kids, and then of course it says that Shem is our ancestor, and it says that people were in Bavel, they were in Babel, and then they moved all around and whatever. That's how we got to where we got. So John, it's a great question, and it's one that is interesting because, of course, in the section that we just read,
Yes.
it lumps together. It lumps together Egypt and the Canaanites, and so you actually then.
Rabbi, great review. Thank you so much.
There you go. Well,
Great question.
Because he gave us Egypt. He gave us no, but it's interesting because again we need to be reminded that the Egyptians and the Canaanites, as far as the Jews were concerned, that is not a good way.
Right.
They didn't like the Egyptians and the Canaanites. And yeah. And so let's read. My rules alone you shall observe, right? And faithfully follow my laws. I, Adonai, am your God, over and over again. You shall keep my laws and my rules by the pursuit of which human beings shall live, right? None of you men shall come near anyone of his own flesh to uncover nakedness. I am Adonai. Now that is the operating principle for everything we're about to read, which is do not commit incest. Now, what is incest? You're about to see. But that's the operating principle. You do not uncover the people in your own family. Now, uncover nakedness, going back to all the way to Noah, is more than just seeing somebody naked. But this is the laws against incest. Your father's nakedness, which again we saw from the story of Noah. Right. That is the nakedness of your mother, you shall not uncover. She is your mother. You shall not uncover her nakedness. Well, that is pretty important. Now, the next law, though, I mean, there's a lot of reasons for it, but not the least of which is the genetic problems of that.
Right.
But this one isn't a genetic problem. It's an ethical problem. And I'll show you why. Because it says, do not uncover the nakedness of your father's wife. It is the nakedness of your father. It doesn't say your mother, which it said so up here.
Right.
It's talking about your stepmother. Doesn't mean you're genetically connected to her. but uncovering her nakedness is uncovering your father's nakedness. So clearly, this isn't just about genetics. That rule right there tells us that this is about what are the consequences of having relationships within your family and what is going on here. And we saw in the book of Kings that some of the kings tried to break this rule by sleeping with their father's concubines. It's the thing that gets Adonijah in trouble, is that he asks Solomon, or he asks Bathsheba to ask Solomon if he could sleep with one of David's concubines. Now, she was very young, and she was probably younger than him. But Solomon basically said, if he sleeps with her, he might as well take over my kingdom. And he has Adonijah killed for doing that. But it's considered, again, breaking the Torah. So they understood it as a more, there's a level of morality here, spirituality here, and not just biology, not just genetics.
Right.
The nakedness of your sister, your father's daughter, or your mother's, whether born into your household or outside, do not uncover their nakedness, which is, again, meaning not just your full brother or sister, but also a half brother or sister. And by extension, one would actually say, perhaps, again, stepbrothers and stepsisters. Now, it doesn't say specifically that, but you could say that your father's daughter, if your father, took on a daughter from, another wife, even if it wasn't his biological daughter, you're not supposed to. The nakedness of your son's daughter or your daughter's daughter, do not uncover their nakedness, for their nakedness is yours. That's your grandchildren. Your grandchildren.
Does that mean you're gonna change diapers?
Oh, I'm kidding you. Oh my gosh, Joanne. Well, no. Well, seeing as how you're not supposed to uncover the nakedness of your
Yeah.
well, we'll get to the rest of it. Yes, but it's very, it's a serious issue, right? And in the sense that, again, the nakedness of your father's wife's daughter, who was born into your father's household, she is your sister. Do not uncover her nakedness. Do not uncover the nakedness of your father's sister. She is your father's flesh. It's your aunt. Again,
So
before,
don't mess around in your family.
yeah, but before we think that this is kind of beyond the pale of what we would expect, just remember something. That's because we follow these rules in America.
Mm-hmm.
They are there because people didn't follow the rules.
Right.
Yeah.
But God created us, so he knew, right, that there couldn't be interaction between relatives. Right. I understand a lot of this has to do with other things, but I'm talking about with your mother, right? Because what Joyce said. So he knew that. But people didn't know that because modern medicine had no idea about that. So they had to be told.
Well, especially with the fact that animals, I mean, you just observe the animal behavior and we know what animals will do. So, it is not necessarily instinctive, though. I don't know. I don't know what to say other than this. This is a rule because people needed it.
Right.
That's why it's there. So your aunts, do not uncover the nakedness of your mother's sister, for she is your mother's flesh. So that's aunts on both sides.
Horrible remove.
Well, we'll get to it. Do not uncover the nakedness of your father's brother. Do not approach his wife. She is your aunt. So even if she's not related to you by blood, by marriage, what are you shaking your head for?
I just have these images.
I understand. I get it. I get it. He doesn't want to think about Aunt Sylvia. That's what he's saying. You don't have to. You shouldn't. You shouldn't. So there's a reason for it, though. Somebody broke this law. Bless you. Do not uncover the nakedness of your daughter-in-law. She is your son's wife. You shall not uncover her nakedness. Now that clearly is not genetic. There's no genetic connection.
It's moral.
It's a moral, yes. And this is, there's a psychological issue. Bless you. There's a psychological issue here too. Just what's going on here? What is happening with a person that they would be doing that?
You go mad at Aunt Sylvia.
Because everyone has an Aunt Sylvia. Every Jew has an Aunt Sylvia. Come on. Dude.
The community, right? That's what I'm reading. Societal, moral.
Yeah. So, community breaks down, you'd think, but clearly people did it. So your daughter-in-law, do not uncover the nakedness of your brother's wife. It is the nakedness of your brother. Now, look at the note. There's a note. There's an asterisk. Wait a second. There's an asterisk. What's the asterisk, folks? Uh-oh. What's the note? Oh, we got to go back up here. Got to go back up here. Wait.
Of your brother,
No,
wife.
that's not the one I thought they were going to talk about. What's the note? John, do you have a note there?
Not for 16.
Oh, there's an exception to this rule.
It's 18.
Oh, 18.
18.
I have 18.
No, 16. No, it's 16. No, the note, it says 1878. No, I thought it was going to give us there's an exception to this, right? Yeah. If your brother didn't have kids with her, you actually are commanded to have sex with your brother's wife. Well, yeah, but to have sex with her, it's not just to marry her to take care. It's to marry her to make sure she has a kid. And then
about that in the movie, or in these period pieces where the person dies and then he steps up and that's the right thing to do.
You just had to go to New York.
Yeah.
Well, it's not just New York. I was going to say, there's so many people who find this when they did their family trees, especially in the Jewish community. It's not just in the Jewish community, but especially, a higher percentage of Jews talk to me about their family tree. They found out that their father married, or not their father, or grandfather, whatever, their ancestor married a woman, and then the woman died, and then she married his sister. Now that's not the same as this, but that happened a lot. All right. Still, it's tough. Do not uncover the nakedness of a woman and her daughter, nor shall you take into your household as a wife her son's daughter or her daughter's daughter and uncover her nakedness. They are kindred. It is depravity. Now, there's a problem here, which is that, let me read one other line. Do not take into your household a wife as a woman, as a rival to her sister, uncover her nakedness in the other's lifetime. So, this is a problem, right? And again, if the woman dies, then that's different, right? And maybe actually it happened, and it happened a lot. It probably happened a lot. The problem, of course, is that Jacob broke this rule. Our ancestor Jacob broke this rule. He married Leah and Rachel. He didn't want to. He didn't ask. He was tricked. But he did break this rule. And so there's an understanding that he was forced into breaking a law of the Torah. But it's not something you're supposed to do. Now, again, I'm looking, I don't want to
explode that you are going to remember, like the footnote of Leviticus 18.
So I do want to tell you, no, but it's not that. It's what you said before. The reason that this was a rule was not, again, because of genetics. It was because of morality and what the consequences would be to people psychologically. So while people would say, "Oh, I don't see anything wrong with it," not that anyone would say that, but John just said it. I'm just saying, I didn't pick on him. There's other people who would have said it. Believe me, there's a lot. You can download these things all the time. It's not what we should be doing, because this is considered a way of messing with someone's head, uncovering the nakedness of your friend or of your father or of somebody else is not a good thing. So if someone was intimate with one of your relatives, when you're intimate with them, it is breaking the wall, if you will, and this is the problem, is breaking this wall. So it's not just genetics. Do not come near a woman during her menstrual period of impurity to uncover her nakedness. So, folks, that's put here, and we read it before. We read it in the last portion, 3 chapters ago. We read this. It's consistent. It was in the other part, and it was in this part. It was in the part of Tazria and Matzorah, and it's here too. So this was an important rule. And people felt that there were consequences to it. And that's why people, there's a famous story in the Talmud where a young widow comes to the rabbis and says, my husband just died. He's a young guy. He was a very diligent, he was a good student. He always worked to fill in. He always prayed. He did all his readings. He did everything he was supposed to do. So the rabbi said to her, did he sleep with you during your menstrual period? And she said, yes, that's why he died. Oh, that was the reason. Go away. I mean, it's not a very good story. I didn't say the story had a happy ending. I'm saying that they took it seriously. Okay, so that's the end of the family. Yes, yeah, that's what we were talking about. Who said it last week? Who said it? Somebody said it last week. So you have kids, wasn't it you? Didn't you say it, Joanne? Yeah. So somebody last week said that the times when people had sex were to encourage procreation. You said it last week.
I said that.
It was last week. All I'm saying is it wasn't last year, it was last week. All right, okay, all right. Just want to make sure that you did see it last week. So yes, it is.
Period, and then you have to wait.
Yes.
4 days.
Yes. Correct, and that's absolutely correct. So that's the end. So that last line was the end of the relatives. But when we get into this, do not have carnal relations with your neighbor's wife and defile yourself with her. Well, that's one that people have been breaking for a long time.
Isn't that
what, 10 Commandments?
Well,
yeah,
covet,
yeah. Yeah, well, I guess there wasn't a lot of coveting. They skipped a couple steps and they went right into bed. So you're not supposed to. So do not let any of your offspring to be offered up to Molech, and do not profane the name of your God. So there's a line about child sacrifice, which we read about. We read about it in Kings, that people were doing it. And here's the line, my friends, 1822, the line that makes everybody go out of their minds. Do not lie with a male as one lies with a woman. It is an abhorrence, a toeva. So there's the line. And then the line after is, do not have carnal relations with any beast and defile yourself thereby. Likewise for a woman, she shall not lend herself to a beast to mate with. It is perversion. So there you have a homosexual relations with bestiality back to back. So this is something that, so to speak. Yes. Yes.
Do you think there's no footnotes here for the political reason?
Oh, well, first of all, that commentary was written a while ago. So I think nowadays people would almost have to write something. I think no, but I think in those days, I think you're right. I think there was a political, it was a decision made from the standpoint of, let's not talk about it. So there was a time when that was, even in the Reform and Conservative movement, which is where that commentary that John has was produced by, up until the late 80s, and then really probably the last 20 years, it wasn't discussed. It is obviously discussed a lot more now because it's the basis for to some extent for the discussion that goes on in our country. Now, look, we've talked about it in previous years, and again, in the context that it's written here, I say, got to read the first, if you're going to read this line, you better read where we started, which is, do not follow the practices of the Canaanites and the Egyptians. The Canaanites, we know, engaged in homosexual relationships. We know that the Jews did too, because it said in the chapter that we read a week ago in Tuesday morning that there were male and female cultic prostitutes that were working in the temple, in the Beit HaMikdash during the last kings of Judah, that they were allowing it to go on even in Jerusalem. Josiah gets rid of it, but it's there. So it was happening. Canaanites' practice was being done by the Jews, and they were not supposed to do it. They were offering sacrifices right above there. They were doing this. Now, if you look at it from the context of what the line, the very beginning of this code, so if you're going to pull it out, you're doing it, you're playing a game, which is that the context is not to be like the people around you. Now, what does that mean for you? I don't know. Maybe it means nothing to you, the context. But look at what the context is. First of all, it's one line in the Torah. I want to make it very clear that people who toss out the entire Torah because of one line, they're insane. That's an insane thing to engage in. I mean, it's ridiculous. But when we look at what happens here, it is definitely in the context of not behaving like the Canaanites and the Egyptians. Now, while I say that may or may not resonate with anybody, I don't really know. First of all, I've talked to religious gay Jews who've said they don't understand this law to be a prohibition against homosexuality. They look at it as a prohibition against treating somebody, treating a relationship with a man the way they would with a woman. And their answer is, that's different. Now you could say, well, that's could be what somebody who's actually behaving as a transsexual would do, which is maybe what they're talking about. But they would say that a homosexual relationship between two men where they're not treating one like a woman wouldn't qualify for this. Now, again, you're making a face, Mike, because they're splitting hairs, but they split hairs much more in the Talmud than that. That, along the lines of what Talmudic reasoning is not unheard of. So that is one answer that Jews who are religious and who are observant, who are gay, come to terms with this. As long as that they're not. Now, some people, I don't want to get too graphic, but the conservative movement up until the 1980s had a ruling that what was really forbidden here was sex that would be conducted between two men that would be like a woman. I just was too euphemistic about it, but they basically said in the 1980s that this law forbids anal sex. That's what they said. Didn't forbid a relationship or maybe even a sexual relationship, but that specific act. Now, is that splitting hairs? Maybe, but that's not where the conservative movement is now, because the conservative movement now has said that any type of relationship is blessed. You can do officiated a wedding. Homosexuals should not be treated as marginalized people. And so there really is almost a feeling that law doesn't apply. Look, the Orthodox world even is trying to come to terms with this. Even in the Orthodox world, especially the modern Orthodox world, there's more of an acceptance of homosexuality today. It's changed. They do. But there was a movie made even 20 years ago called Trembling Before God. It was about 20 years ago, about gay Orthodox Jews and dealing with this. It's very difficult. It's very difficult. I have personal experience with it. I have through my stepbrother. My stepbrother's ex-wife was a woman who became a guy. And she's Orthodox. And she continues to live in an Orthodox community went from a woman's name to a guy's name. She has a complete male. She had 4 kids before she became a man, and she lives in North Hollywood. I mean, this is real. These are real lives for people, and they still maintain it. She still maintains an Orthodox life, completely Orthodox lifestyle. She wears tzitzit. She keeps kosher. Look, I got news for you. I have a real problem. I don't have a problem. I don't have a problem with how people interpret this and how they come to terms with it, because it's one line of the Torah. And for people,
that's the right point. That's one line of the Torah. And if you're a Karaite, okay, I can understand that. But there's so many other lines in the Torah that we don't abide by.
If anybody eats pork and gets upset by this line, on what basis? You decided that eating pork is okay, but this is not okay? So that's my big problem with it, is if you're going to pick and choose. Now, look, if you're going to struggle with it, which Orthodox Jews do and religious Jews do, then it's a problem. But if you're going to pick this law as the only law that you're going to follow, why? What does it say about your priorities? No, it doesn't. Of course it doesn't. Now, these laws clearly apply from the very beginning, though, Mike, let's be honest, to men.
Right. Yeah.
And so the rabbis did from this also infer that women are not allowed to. But the issue is women, for the most part, wouldn't have been able to make that decision. Women would not have been able to say, for the most part, hey, I want to live with a woman.
Back then, no.
So that's another issue here. But clearly, these laws are being directed at men, the men who could actually make the marriages, who could enforce the marriages, who could create the marriages. Obviously, bestiality goes back all the way to the beginning, if you will. And then it says, do not defile yourselves in any of those ways, for it is by that the nations I'm casting out before you defile themselves. And so clearly, if you didn't see it at the beginning, there's a line right after it, almost right after it, which says, stop behaving like the people around you. Now, the one problem I'm going to say about that is that this is where the stricter Orthodox world chimes in on this, which is Jews trying to be accepting of homosexuality are trying to behave like general society. And that's all. If somebody is going to take what I just said out of context, that's not what I'm saying should happen. I'm just saying that is the answer that's given. Stop trying to be.
Are there any specific laws against pedophilia in the Bible?
Well, the age at which somebody would be eligible to be into a marriage is not specific. It's not, but the problem is that there are no ages for anything. So there's nothing in the Torah that talks about a bar mitzvah age. There's nothing that says at 13 a person's responsible. So there are no laws about that. And the reality is the Torah only specifies what you're not allowed to do. There's nothing in here that says at what age. There does not say at what age of a child. It does not say that. So it does not say that. It does not mean that it was permitted. But the Torah doesn't forbid everything that you're not supposed to do, I would say. But I will say that it doesn't say it. But again, what's the operating principle? Don't behave like the people around you. You must keep my laws, my rules, and you must not do any of those abhorrent things, neither the citizen nor the stranger who resides among you. For all those abhorrent things were done by the people who were in the land before you, and the land become defiled. Today in Israel, there is no gay marriage. Why? Because only Orthodox rabbis can perform a wedding in Israel. But you can have a marriage outside of Israel, and you can live together with your partner, with your husband. It's just not recognized by the it's not recognized as a marriage in Israel. But Israel for years has allowed people to have full domestic partner, being able to make someone their designee in a will. And because Israel has free medical care, it was never an issue of designate somebody as your medical person. So, and again, why you do that? So the land does not spew you out for defiling it as it spewed out the nation that came before you. Again, the Canaanites. And any of those abhorrent things, such persons shall be cut off from the people. You shall keep my charge not to engage in any of the abhorrent practices that were carried on before you, and you shall not defile yourselves through them. I, Adonai, am your God. And there we have the end of Achrei Mot. Now, I will tell you, we went a couple minutes over, but I did tell you we would get to the discussion and to the answer of that. Nowhere does it say here that a person who has committed a homosexual act will be killed. It does not say that here. It is wait. Next week we're reading Kedoshim, which is a whole lot of beautiful laws. It's got beautiful, beautiful laws in Kedoshim. And I will tell you that you must come back next week, because right there in chapter 20, where we get the laws of all the great things about what we're supposed to do, love your neighbors yourself, talks again about what people you're not allowed to have sex with to some extent. And it says right there about lying with your daughter-in-law. And right here in 2013, it says, If a man lies with a male as one lies with a woman, the two of them have done an abhorrent thing, they shall be put to death, and they retain the blood guilt. So it did not say it in 18. I 100% did not say it. In the laws at Kedoshim, in the laws in next week's portion. So you got to
one line.
Oh, it's two. No, it's two lines. It's two lines. It's two lines. It's two lines. It's two lines in the entire Torah. But the connection between Kedoshim, Akremot and Kedoshim are definitely important. And we'll see them next week. And we'll see why those two Torah portions go back to back. But there probably were two different codes. They're two different codes. Bye, everybody. Take care. And on that happy note.